I guess in some ways a bit disagreeable weather-wise, but this time of year it could be a whole lot worse. And we're thankful that you're here. We'll rejoice and be glad in the day that the Lord hath made. The text for our lesson this morning comes from 1 Samuel chapter 18. And I might just ask, as you're turning there, have you heard all the latest flap about Mike Pence? Mike Pence, of course, is our new vice president. And he riled up some of the people recently because he refused to go to dinner with other women and not his wife. And they just thought that was rather atrocious. And he also has the habit of not attending parties, if you will, or meetings where alcohol is served without his wife. And I'm not turning political on you. That's not where we're going. We're not going to talk about Mike Pence, except just to show that this individual is a man of honorable character. The left just don't know how to deal with that, how to deal with somebody that has deep convictions, if you will. And I said all that to say this, chapter 18 of 1 Samuel. To set the stage for this, Saul is reigning king of Israel. David has been anointed king of Israel. God took the kingdom away from Saul, except Saul was still the one that was on the throne. And so David has been anointed king. And in the previous chapter, in chapter 17 of 1 Samuel, David has become, maybe before chapter 17, but David has also become Saul's chief musician, the one who plays the harp for Saul when his spirit is troubled. And in chapter 17, David has just slain Goliath of Gath. He didn't use any traditional means, I guess. He used a sling and a stone to slay Goliath. Chapter 17 begins with telling us about the relationship between David and Jonathan. And that in and of itself is quite a relationship. But chapter 18 also begins to describe for us the persecution that Saul inflicted upon David, and gives us some of the reasons why. But I want to call your attention first to verse 5 of 1 Samuel 18. And it says, "And David went out whithersoever Saul sent him." David has been appointed by Saul as one who was over his soldiers. And I guess we'll get to that here in just a moment. But I want to call specifically your attention in this verse to the next phrase. It says, "and behaved himself wisely." David went wherever Saul sent him, and behaved himself wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and it was good in the sight of all the people, and it was good in the sight of Saul's servants. And so, the title for our lesson this morning is Behave Wisely. In all of this, David behaved himself wisely. In the next verses, we find that David was in the business of going about wherever Saul sent him, and Saul had appointed him over the men of war. And so where do you go if you're the one over the men of war? You go to war. And so when David would come back to the city, the women of the city, it says in verse 7, sang to one another as they played, and said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Well, obviously David didn't do it all by himself, but he led the soldiers valiantly, and was much more adept at it, much more victorious at it than King Saul. And so as a result, if we read in verse 9, we find that David became Saul's enemy. We'll read verses 8 and 9 because that kind of helps us to get the context exact. And it says, And Saul was very wroth, and this saying displeased him. And he said, They have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. What can he have more but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day and forward. In other words, David became Saul's enemy. Saul was obviously jealous. They've ascribed to David 10,000, but only to me thousands. He didn't like the fact that the people were liking David more than they were himself. And Saul was kind of up against it, at least at the beginning. In verse 10, it says, And it came to pass on the morrow that an evil spirit from God came mightily upon Saul, and he prophesied in the midst of his house. And David played with his hand as he did day by day. You see, David was called to be musician, the chief musician, to comfort Saul. And even though he had become his enemy, he was still there doing what he was supposed to be doing. He was, in fact, behaving himself wisely. But the rest of verse 10, it says, And Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul cast the spear, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall. Now, what kind of thanks is that? You call the young man in to make good music for you and to comfort you, and then you throw a spear at him and try to stick him to the wall. The account goes on, it says, And David avoided out of his presence twice. Not just once, but twice. Therefore, verse 12, it says, And Saul was afraid of David because Jehovah was with him and was departed from Saul. Therefore Saul removed him from him and made him his captain over 1,000, and he went out and came in before the people. Saul recognized the source of David's success. It says he was afraid of him because Jehovah was with him. And what he should have already recognized, because Saul has told him, Samuel had told Saul, that God has taken the kingdom from him, that God is no longer with him because of Saul's own sin. But he was afraid of David because he recognized that David had God's assistance and Saul did not. And so Saul thought, well, I'll make him a captain of 1,000, and that'll put him in a little different place, and maybe somebody else can do away with him for me, But notice verse 14. And David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and Jehovah was with him. One thing we find recurring in this chapter is the fact, that statement, David behaved himself wisely. And so David conducted himself wisely, not only in his dealings with Saul, but in all of his life in this account. And one verse in this chapter that I found to be quite intriguing is the next one, verse 15. And when Saul saw that he behaved himself very wisely, he stood in awe of him. Now, David had done things that I would think that Saul say Saul saw seashells down by the seashore or something like that. Saul should have known that David was an outstanding individual. Remember when Goliath was threatening the soldiers of Israel, and he says, send down one champion, and if he kills me, then we'll be your servants, and if I kill him, you'll be our servants. And how many of these seasoned fighting men challenged Saul, Goliath? Not a one. He stood every day and made that same challenge. And I think it was, I don't remember just exactly now, but it was a month or more that he had come out every day and made the same challenge. And the young shepherd boy, David, and he wasn't a little boy, but he was a young man. But he was not a seasoned warrior in that sense. Put his faith in God and was victorious. David wasn't your ordinary individual. But this account tells us in verse 4 that he behaved himself wisely. I guess it's verse 5. Verse 5, and also again in verse 14. And then when Saul saw that David behaved himself not just wisely, the account tells us, but very wisely, Saul had to stand back and stand in awe of him. Verse 16 then, it says, but all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. David was in the public's eye. But what did he do? He behaved himself wisely in the public's eye. he went out and came in before them. It's kind of difficult to get a real consistent handle on how and why Saul did things. Because in the next paragraph we find that Saul offers to David his daughter to be David's wife. And David said in verse 18, he says, "And who am I? What is my life or my father's family in Israel that I should be son-in-law to the king?" You know, David was a little bit gun-shy and perhaps humble by saying, you know, who am I that I should be son-in-law to the king? And this was in regard to Saul's daughter Merab. And when it came time for Saul to give Merab to David, he did the switcheroony. He gave her to somebody else. And I don't know that David was terribly disappointed. But Saul didn't keep his word. And then he finds out, as we read on down, that his other daughter, Michal, loved David. And so that made David happy, that made Saul happy, and so Saul gave to David Michal to be his wife. And if the story ended there, we could say, well, all is well that ends well. You know, it would have been all right. However, in the next paragraph, we find Saul hadn't forgiven David. Saul was still, or David was still the enemy of Saul. And so Saul had his servants to commune with David secretly. And he said, well, you can have Michal to be your wife if you bring me 100 foreskins of the Philistines. Thinking that there's no way he could do that. That the Philistines would do away with David and get him out of Saul's hair. And of course, what happened? The Lord was with David, and he brought twice as many as he needed to. And so Saul was perhaps forced to give him Michal, his daughter, to wife. In verse 28, it says, "And Saul saw and knew that Jehovah was with David, and Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul was yet the more afraid of David, and Saul was David's enemy continually." And so the persecution begins from Saul to David. But the last verse of chapter 18 says, "Then the princes of the Philistines went forth, and it came to pass as often as they went forth that David did what? Behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was much set by." In all of this, David maintained his integrity. David behaved himself wisely. I'd like for you to notice with me a couple of other scriptures. The first of these is Proverbs 28. Proverbs 28 and verse 26. The wise man Solomon records for us this proverb: "He that trusteth in his own heart is a fool, but whoso walketh wisely, he shall be delivered." David was no fool. David walked wisely, and God delivered him. It is a fascinating story to read through 1 Samuel and to see the things that took place between Saul and David. And how David, not only on the occasions that we've been reading about in chapter 18, but throughout all of his dealings with Saul, David behaved himself wisely. And as the proverb says, he was delivered. How many times, if you remember reading about this conflict between the two, did David have opportunity to defeat Saul? And yet he refused. Why? Because of his respect for God's anointed. David dealt wisely. David behaved himself wisely throughout all of this trial. You remember when David and his men were hiding in the cave, and Saul came in to the front of the cave and went to sleep. And David went up and cut off a piece of his skirt. David didn't have to cut off a piece of Saul's skirt. He could have just done him in and been done with it. But he didn't, because Saul was God's anointed. That's just, another example of how David behaved himself wisely. Now, also, I'd like for you to consider with me from the Psalms, Psalm 101. We're going to read verses 2 through 4. Psalm 101, verses 2 through 4. And this is attributed to David. The psalmist said, "I will behave myself wisely in a perfect way. O, when wilt thou come unto me? I will walk within my house with a perfect heart. I will set no base thing before mine eyes. I hate the work of them that turn aside. It shall not cleave unto me. A perverse heart shall depart from me. I will know no evil thing." This psalm tells us the attitude of David. David's intentions, David's purpose was to behave himself wisely in a perfect way. And it occurred to David that in order for him to do that, he said, "I will set no base thing before mine eyes." What a commitment David had to do what was right, to behave himself wisely in a perfect way. And then in verse 4, he says, it was his intent, he says that a perverse heart shall depart from me, and I will know no evil thing. David set his mind to the things that were right. Was David 100% successful? No. We know that. But yet his purpose, his intentions, his attitude was to walk wisely in a perfect way, to behave himself wisely in a perfect way. There's two things I'd like you to remember. Everything that I just said, that's number one. And what I'm going to say, that's number two. Now, if you can do that, you're probably doing better than I am. 1 Peter chapter 4. Verses 3 and 4. 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 3 and 4. For the time past may suffice to have wrought the desire of the Gentiles, and to have walked in lasciviousness, lust, wine-bibbings, revellings, carousing, and abominable idolatries, wherein they think it strange that ye run not with them into the same excess of riot, speaking evil of you. You say, well, what are you calling our attention to this passage for? Do you remember when we read in 1 Samuel 18 and verse 15, where it says, when Saul saw that David behaved himself very wisely, what Saul's response was? Saul stood in awe of him. Sometimes our lives have been like these we just read about here in verse 3. Sinful lives, very sinful. And we hear the gospel message and we respond to the gospel and we become different in our focus, different in what's important to us. And our former companions, associates, acquaintances wonder why we don't do what they do anymore. Not all of them will be like Saul and stand in awe of us. Some of them will even go so far as to what? Speak evil of us. But if we behave ourselves wisely in a perfect way, people will notice. They will see the power of the gospel to change people's lives. Secondly, I'd like you to remember Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, where the scripture says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service. And be not fashioned according to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Let us remember to behave ourselves wisely in a perfect way and not let the world fashion us according to its pattern, according to its desires, according to its will, but rather let us be fashioned according to the will of God. If you're here this morning and have some need to respond to heaven's invitation, the time is now. If we can assist you in any way, won't you come and let it be known as together we stand